Hi guys, so this is chapter 15's lecture, which is the evolution of microbial life. And life began on the planet as microbes. So the very first signs of life are single-celled organisms that we refer to as microbes. Microbes, by the way, is just anything small enough that you need a microscope to see it. So micro refers to small. All right, let's take a look at our timeline here. So the first, Roman numeral 1 talks about the Precambrian period, which is the period that you can see 88% of all geological time is spent in. And then, so here we have the Precambrian word, and we can see that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. So BYA in your outline stands for billion years ago. And then, of course, MYA would be million years ago. But really, we're dealing with billions of years. So that's quite a long, long time. So we have some ancestor to all present day life, right? There has to have been something that came about first. So that is a cell that resembles more of a bacteria. So it's going to be called a prokaryotic cell. And then the very first thing that arose, right, letter B, is the origin of prokaryotes. So about 3.5 billion years ago, so about a billion years after life, planet Earth has been around, we have some kind of single-celled fossils that we have detected. So what's interesting is that some people think that the Earth's atmosphere, because so much of life depends on oxygen, that the atmosphere might have been, based on oxygen, but it wasn't. So these prokaryotic fossils, these prokaryotic cells, actually began to metabolize the chemicals in the atmosphere and in the water, but the atmosphere was not didn't have the oxygen content it did. So it's these prokaryotic cells that actually created a more modern type of atmosphere with oxygen. So we can see that atmospheric oxygen begins to appear after the prokaryotes. So the prokaryotes actually produced and helped maintain or create this atmospheric oxygen. So now let's move on. We're still in the Precambrian period, where we find the oldest eukaryotic fossils. So remember, the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that eukaryotes will have membrane-bound organelles. They will also have a membrane-bound nucleus, and they're usually much larger than our prokaryotes. So the eukaryotes developed around 2.1 billion years ago, so roughly another billion years, right? Very long time for these to appear. Then after our single-celled eukaryotic organisms arose, we find multicellular organisms. And that should make kind of some sense to you, right? Single cells and then more complicated organisms be multicellular organisms. And then once we have multicellular organisms, then we're going to start to form more complex creatures, living things. So we move on to the oldest animal fossils. And so the oldest, very primitive first animals that we have, right, they're still formed in the Precambrian period here. But then we shift over to something called the Paleozoic era, and there was something called the Cambrian Explosions. The Cambrian Explosion is where we start to find a huge diversity of fossils. And so a huge diversity of different kinds of organisms occurred in the Cambrian Explosion. So that was a really important time in our Earth's history. And then we can see that we have plants colonizing land, and we have extinction of dinosaurs and the first humans. So the humans have developed really, really close to modern time. If we look at the next slide, this is a nice representation of the data we just talked about. So this is at zero time, the present, right? If we go back in time, right? This is again billion years ago. 4.6 billion years ago, we have the Earth. Then about a billion years later, we have prokaryotes. Prokaryotes occupy the Earth for about a billion years, and then they change the atmosphere to produce more oxygen. The oxygen in the atmosphere remains throughout modern history, we have the single-celled organisms arise, the eukaryotes after prokaryotes, then multicellular eukaryotes, then we have animals, then we have land. So this is important because where did the animals first develop or evolve? They would be in the water, right? So life was pretty much confined to the waters. And then there was this movement onto land. So colonization of land, of plants, as well as animals. And then we have a little tiny sliver where humans have existed on the planet. So that you want to know the sequence of these steps, okay? You don't need to know the exact numbers. The only numbers I want you to know is the origin of the Earth at 4.6 and then the origin of prokaryotes at 3.5, which is bolded in your outline. So let's put these in order. The oldest event goes first, the newest event goes last. So why don't you go ahead and think about it. You can pause the recording if you'd like, and I'm going to tell you the answers right now. Okay, so the oldest event here is going to be our origin of our prokaryotes. Then we're going to have an origin of our eukaryotes. Then we're going to have an origin of multicellular organisms. Then we're going to have an origin of, colonized land, right? And then we're going to have the origin of humans, the very last. Now, how did life start on the planet? Nobody knows. Okay, so that's number 2 on your outline. Nobody knows for sure how life began on the Earth. There are strong hypotheses out there, but at this point we have 3 working hypotheses. The first one used to be favored. It's no longer favored anymore, and now we're thinking it's number 2. And then number 3 is a fun idea. So we'll share all these ideas with you. So the first one, spontaneous generation or chemical abiogenesis. So the word abiogenesis, right? Genesis is the beginning. Bio refers to life, but when you put an A in front of something, it negates that. So this is sort of meaning you're starting life without a living thing. So you're starting life with basically inorganic molecules or molecules that are not alive. They self-assemble and they spontaneously create a cell that has the qualities of life. So over millions of years, natural selection favored the most efficient pre-cells and the first prokaryotic cells evolved. So abiogenesis, right? Did life come from non-living materials when the Earth's atmosphere was very different? So we know that oxygen wasn't present in the atmosphere. Oxygen is actually very corrosive and damages molecules. And this is the reason why we actually want, to take antioxidants. A lot of our vitamins act as antioxidants because when you breathe oxygen, it does cause some kind of damage to your inside of the cells. Sometimes it damages DNA. And so the vitamins called antioxidants will actually help clean up that damage. So oxygen is a little bit nasty, but it wasn't around in the atmosphere, right? So it's not damaging in those early times because oxygen wasn't there. And then there was more energy sources in the atmosphere. So lightning, volcanic activity, there's a lot more UV light. So they think that because of this very, very different environment, right? Most biologists think that the chemical and physical processes in Earth's primordial environment, this is an old environment, could lead to simple cells. And this is not just a thought, they actually did the experiment. So this is an artist's rendering of this kind of very old Earth. And then this is the experiment that scientists did. So Miller and Urey, they actually created something to mimic what they think was Earth's primordial environment. So they had water, they are using the atmosphere here that contained the chemical compounds that were present in the Earth's atmosphere very, very early on. So when they heated up the water vapor moves up this glass tubing. It interacts with the inorganic molecules inside of the atmosphere. They added some energy. So this is like lightning striking. And then they found that as the water cooled and condensed, they captured what was left. and they looked at this and they actually found amino acids. So they found the precursors to proteins that formed spontaneously when you had water and all these other inorganic molecules. So they thought, well, if you can form organic molecules from these inorganic precursors given the right conditions, then maybe it's possible that these organic molecules came together in a cell and they created life. This is one of the scientists that conducted this experiment, and he's next to his globe here, right, with the electricity coming in. And it's been repeated by other scientists, and this experiment supports the idea that we can create organic molecules and then perhaps life just spontaneously came together and organized to form that first cell on Earth. The second hypothesis is that the organic molecules originated in deep sea thermal vents rather than on top of the Earth's where the atmosphere was. And this has the most support at the moment. Oops, sorry, this is, let me actually back up. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So one of the, still dealing with the spontaneous generation, so let's talk about RNA. So RNA is a much simpler molecule than DNA. Now that you guys have worked with DNA and RNA, you know that DNA is double-stranded. The two strands have to come together and bind in a complementary fashion. But RNA is much faster, right? RNA is a shorter molecule, it is single-stranded, and it can be created very quickly. And you can create a copy of that or a complement of that very quickly. So they thought that the first sort of genetic information of the world was RNA instead of DNA, just because RNA is more likely to spontaneously arise and form, and it can carry hereditary information. So we do also know that there are enzymes called ribozymes that can build RNA. And so RNA seems to be the first molecule of genetic information, DNA following that. All right, so that's letter A. Now, the deep sea thermal vents. Here is a nice image of a deep sea thermal vent. So these are little volcanoes that are on the ocean floor. And you can see in the diagram here how complicated that these structures are. They're being studied by a lot of scientists. And the environment within this deep sea thermal vent and surrounding the deep sea thermal vent does contain a lot of life. There's organic molecules there. And if you think about just how unlikely life would form down there. So the ocean floor is incredibly dark. So there's no sunlight coming in. There's no lightning to serve as an energy source, right? So it's incredibly cold. There's a whole lot of pressure, right? A tremendous amount of pressure on this ocean floor. So it's pretty strange that life would form here, but it does. So it's teeming with life. There's lots of microbes there. There's lots of multicellular animals around deep sea thermal vents that all thrive. So where's the energy source? Because all life requires an energy source, and it's this hydrothermal energy that's being pushed from the core of the Earth. So the heated material from the core of the Earth will push through and create a very, very hot environment here. So this is our energy source, is this hot energy coming from the core of the Earth. It's very nutrient rich around here. So it's different than, just the bare ocean floor. And one of the fun things to think about is these hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor probably haven't changed much. If you think about what changes, with evolution is really everything we talk about has been on the surface, right? So animals and plants and things that are on the surface of the planet are really susceptible to changes in the atmosphere, to changes in weather pattern, and that really pushes and drives evolution. So things will change quickly when the environment changes on the surface of the planet. But if you dive down to the ocean floor, what has changed for the bottom of the ocean since the Earth just began, when the Earth just started? Very little, probably, right? Because whatever goes on the surface of the planet, how much does that impact the ocean floor? So of course it should impact it some, but maybe not in the ways that the surface of the planet is being impacted by those different changes. So since there is life on the ocean floor, perhaps this is where it formed, right? Because life also did form in the water. It's a water-based life at first. So that's the operating hypothesis because it exists today. It's probably not changed very much from the past. And we have all the resources that living things need. We have an energy source, we have organic molecules being formed, and we have, yeah, and it's just evidenced by the teeming amount of life that's there anyway. All right, the last origin of life hypothesis is panspermia. So let's look at panspermia. This is a fun one to think about too. So pan means the world. It's a prefix that means the world. Like pandemic. Pandemic is what happens, it's a category that you assign an infection when it is worldwide, right? So the word pan refers to the world. And this is just an idea that perhaps life, the first cell, the first organic molecules, were actually formed not on planet Earth, but on another planet out in the universe, and that it traveled to the Earth on a meteor. And when the meteor hit the Earth, it seeded the Earth, right? Like sperm, it seeded the Earth with these living things, and that's how we evolved. Or life evolved, I should say life evolved, right? So evidence for this, you would think that, oh, meteors, when they strike the Earth, they come down, they burn up, all that fire and the impact and, you know, just the complete destruction of matter would take place if, you know, as the meteor falls through the Earth's atmosphere and hits the Earth. But it's been shown there are some spores that can survive this impact. So living things have been shown to survive, bacteria have been shown to survive this impact. So that's why the panspermia hypothesis is still hanging out. Okay, and also really fun to think about. All right, so that concludes part 1.